All right, so welcome back, everyone. So today we are diving into Genesis 20, and so we do get Sue. Lovely. Right as we start, what I want you all to do is put your finger on chapter 20, and or like put a pin in your Bible or something and flip back and find where chapter 12 is.
Got it.
Okay.
I'm not there yet. Hang on. There. Okay.
All right. So we're going to do a quick speed read of chapter 12 because it relates to our story today. And I know I didn't assign it in advance. So we might have a few back and forths between these two. But this is just the quick refresh of what's happening in chapter 12. So chapter 11, we have, hey, Sue. I know you're away from the computer. We're pausing before we get to chapter 20 and we're going back to chapter 12 real quick.
Okay.
All right. So chapter 11, we have all the descendants after Noah that connect Noah and Abraham. We have the initial lineage of Abraham. The beginning of 12, we have the call of Abraham where he is called and just God says, go, and Abram goes. And then the next story, the second half of 12, is Abram and Sarai in Egypt. We read that there's a famine in the land, and so they leave from kind of where modern day Palestine is, and they go to Egypt. Abram passes Sarah off as his sister, therefore Pharaoh takes Sarah into his house. However, there is a few things going on, and the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai. And then basically Pharaoh calls Abram back in and says, what have you done to me? What's going on? What in the world is happening? And Abram has to kind of confess that, oh yeah, I said she was my sister, but she's actually my wife. And then Pharaoh's kind of mad, but sends Abram away with a lot of gifts. And so there's, let's see, Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him and sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So he kind of like sends him out and says like, come on, man, that's not cool. Don't do that. But they escape and all is well. And just because all of these little details are interesting and how they relate to today's story, the story that follows immediately after in 13 is Abram and Lot separate, and then Lot has to be rescued. And so we have this like the matriarch in danger kind of right next to a story about Lot. And just before that, we also get the covenant. So we have covenant, matriarch in danger, and Lot, and these kind of all flow right together. So that was just a refresher of 11, 12, and a little bit after. Let's flip back to chapter 20, where we find, once again, a story about the matriarch in danger. It is this time preceded by a story of Lot, and Lot being in danger. Instead of it coming after, this time it comes beforehand. Before that was also more talk of the covenant. So we have these kind of three pieces that kind of, they're in a slightly different order, but they're all lined up together. At this point, Sarah's had her name changed from Sarai to Sarah, but she's been brought into the covenant specifically by name, saying, no, you are the one for who the descendants are going to come through. And here we have a story of Abram evidently going to yet another land, and once again doing the same stunt that he did before and saying, hey, yeah, this one's my sister. So for those who read, are there any other initial similarities to bring up between these two stories, just off the top of your head? Any similarities or differences? What's going on between these two stories?
One of the differences seemed to me that it didn't appear to be completely necessary in this case. So there wasn't real danger. It didn't make sense to me that he would do that. Maybe I missed it.
So yeah, the danger seems to be at a different level, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
And he thought there was danger, he said. That was his excuse, but I'm not sure. Just doesn't make sense. Maybe he's trying to get his wife pregnant by somebody else. I don't know.
What is the significance of the name changes? You know, Sarai's now Sarah, Abram's now Abraham. What significance does that have?
So we talked about this a little bit when it came up, because that was part of Sarah being brought into the covenant. There's kind of two lines of thinking. It's one that, like, it's almost like you have to constantly be aware that, like, things have changed when your name changes, kind of a thing. You're reminded of the covenant again and again and again if you're called something different.
Okay.
Abram's name change means it literally puts father of many is basically the rough translation of Abraham. Abraham. And then Sarah's name means princess, but it basically changes dialects. Both of them are dialectical shifts of a similar name. I mean, not dissimilar between, like, I know I did this in Spanish class. We were given like Spanish names, and often most of us chose names that were the same name, just in like a different dialect. So Christina becomes Cristina. It's not dissimilar to that of they shifted into, what would it be at the time? The Canaanite dialect from the dialect where they came from. So their names are basically localized in a way.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Yeah, so here, like, we have their like localized names. This is very much at a different point in the story, or by some degree.
Okay.
Yeah, Mary Ellen?
I did notice this is the first time in my memory that it's explained, this sister-wife thing, where they are siblings from the father, but not their mothers. And that all came out in here, which I thought was very interesting, and some potential for discussion. And, because before it had been confusing whether he's calling her his wife or his sister, and, giving her away to other men and on. But
yeah, that is a very good detail to bring out, because it changes slightly Abram's honesty or dishonesty if it's like, well, it's technically true. Like, I didn't technically lie, even if it was misleading. So, but that's that kind of correct on a technicality is bearing a lot of weight in the story. So yes, we will talk about what's going on with that kind of piece. But it was absent in the other one. In the other one, it just looked like Abram was lying.
Mm-hmm.
He's still lying.
And Pharaoh actually took her for his wife. Whereas here, King, what is it? Abimelech, yeah. Abimelech had not approached her.
Right.
So he hadn't really taken her truly as his wife, because God warned him not to.
She was abducted, just not, he didn't go near her after the abduction.
Yes, it wasn't consummated.
Yeah. So the other thing I'll point out is the difference between Pharaoh and King Abimelech. Those are not people at the same rank.
Okay.
Because Pharaoh is like Egypt is an empire. Egypt is a power broker. has been a power broker. It gives a air of grandiosity, almost a larger than life. We talked when we discussed chapter 12 that that version of the story has echoes of the Exodus in Egypt. There's some like echoes worked into that story. Like there's plagues, there's Pharaoh, there's an Exodus, there's like wealth as the Exodus. Like there's all that Exodus. So it almost has echoes of a story that's going to come. Versus King Abimelech is just a local king, and it doesn't have some of those Exodus elements to it. So
I'm wondering, isn't it incest to marry your half sister?
By our standards, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I would have to. That is not uncommon in the Bible. It's not fully endorsed to marry your half sister, but it's also like we can get into that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There are some dynamics there, but yes, by today's standards, it's incest. It was not unheard of in other times. So, all right. So let's dive into the actual meat and potatoes. What I want you to think about in the back of your mind, because we have these two stories, we've kind of drawn out some of the initial comparisons. Source-wise, because we do talk about sources, this, I was looking in my notes just to like catch up on some of the details. This is considered the first entire story, like intact story, not just like bits and pieces, from the E source, the Elohim. So what you'll notice is the Lord is not a term you'll see in this story. This is talking a lot about God, using the term Elohim. So they think that this is an intact story from a different tradition. That's what scholars are saying. So the question is this a repeat of the other story, or did this happen more than once in a similar way? Because evidently Abraham is doing this kind of stunt often. So that's what I want you to be thinking about in the back of your head is what's going on here, or just like in the context of the entire story of Genesis. But let's actually dive in. So we have just above the shameful origins of Moab and Amnon, we have kind of this whole story of Lot. We go back to Abraham, and it's like just continuing on in the story. He's been camped out in one place for a while. He decides he's going to go to the Negev. I do have, let's change that real quick. I did bring up pictures because I was actually curious about this one. The Negev is actually kind of this desertous region where there is like water flowing through it, but you'll see this big desert area. It's kind of on the eastern side of ancient Israel, but you can kind of see the desertous area. Just once again, always to give you some like mental image clues, there is streams and a little bit of wildlife. If you've been there, you may know this area for some of the waterfalls. There's some really pretty nooks and crannies in there, but if you get away from the water, it gets desert really quick. So he decides to travel to the desert region, and he's residing in a place as an alien. So that is an interesting just tidbit that at this point, it sounds like he kind of has a home in Canaan, enough to the fact that when he goes somewhere else, he's seen as like being an outsider. Okay. But then when he goes to this area, he is broadcasting that Sarah's his sister. And then we have King Abimelech sent and took Sarah. So it's also interesting that evidently Abram's at least a to-do enough person. He catches the eye of the king. Mary Ellen, did I see an almost hand? What's up?
one thing with verse 4, Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you destroy? It's the first time that the opposing male, whatever, is of the faith, that he is talking to the Lord. And I don't recall that in any of the other stories, the opposing male in the story had any relation to the Lord at all. This connection to me is brand new.
Right. It's interesting. So like when things go wrong with Pharaoh calls in Abraham.
Yeah.
Or Abram at the time. But yeah, evidently King Abimelech, it's also interesting because this one is seen in a dream.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about the multiple times we've talked about the covenant of and the times that God has approached Abraham, there's one version where God approaches him in a dream, right? Mm-hmm. This is kind of in line with more that. And that version of the covenant, remember, is a lot more tribal. It has like the cutting of the animals and we're going to walk with torches between them. And that was in a dream state. Once again, we have this kind of dream state. But yeah, the king directly talks with God. Language note, the Lord there is the title, like Lord and Lady Lord. He's not, King Abimelech's not calling God by name, which is the one detail I'll throw in there, but it is a recognition of like, hey, like you have power, I'm innocent. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's maybe in my house, but I haven't done anything to her. She's just, I took her. I didn't know. But what do you think? I mean, what brings so much meaning out of the fact that this evidently neighboring king does recognize God when God shows up?
Especially if God says, I'm going to kill you.
Right. Uh-huh.
You're going to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. In 6, he said, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. This wasn't Abimelech on his own making the decision. God is claiming credit for right. Abimelech not taking Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
That was interesting.
Yeah. So in all of this, it sounds like God has a vested interest in like not just Abraham and Sarah, but there seems to be a vested interest in this King Abimelech, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So times like this always make me wonder, like this is one story. This is one series of events. This is kind of like, we have a few points of view, but I think about like, so if this is what is recorded of God's doing, what don't we have recorded of God's interactions outside of this set of stories? Because it almost makes me feel like God is active in this area with this group of people. We just don't necessarily, we have like a little window, but it does seem like God's more active in some of these people's lives.
Yeah, in fact, God said in the dream, God says, I orchestrated the whole thing. You know, I knew what was going on. I kept you from not sinning against me, you know, by keeping you away from her. So I did all this. Now, the question is, why?
Why?
I mean, what significance does this have? You know, this is twice Abraham's done the same thing, you know, and each time he's gotten away with it. But what's the basic underlying significance of these acts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
Chris, I just wanted to comment that you said that this is evidence of God active in their lives. My response to that is not only active, but interactive.
Yeah.
It isn't just God doing. There's, the response, there's almost conversation, and God is there protecting Abimelech from making this huge mistake. But yet there's no censure of Abraham for setting Sarah up. She must be really tired of this. She's getting offered for, sex with the ruler. But there's no censure of Abraham that I can recall here. So.
Right. So here comes the question of free will, because God seems to be willing to pull the strings on some people, and over here Abraham's just like going wild. Like, why isn't God pulling strings over in Abram's to stop him from doing this silly scheme?
Yeah. What was it common to do this particular thing when you were going to, meeting with another tribe and you were worried to offer your wife? Was that a common practice?
I cannot say this definitively, but this will come up more when we start talking about Jacob and Esau.
Okay.
But there is kind of a reputation that the stories in the Jewish, in like specifically Genesis, but in some of the other ones, in the other books as well, is that a lot of our main characters are kind of tricksters. It's like this underdog trickster kind of persona, which is maligned as a bad Jewish stereotype at certain points in history. So I do want to like point out that like that's not always like, there is a dangerous side to this. But especially when Jacob comes onto the scene, Jacob is like square one of like this kind of underdog trickster character, but not like bad trickster, more like endearing trickster. Like, I have to do something, be outside the norm because I am not powerful in the way that other people are powerful. A lot of the characters fall into this trope of not necessarily being physically strong, and so they're trying to outwit people. So I wouldn't say that this is common, but this kind of starts that tradition of a little bit of that, like, I'm trying to outwit people. Mm-hmm. What I will say may be slightly going on is the fact that marriage is often the bedrock for alliances. So a lot of these kings that like have many wives, they the understanding a lot of times is that they kind of have a main wife, which is like the person they actually spend time with or have like a stronger relationship with, or maybe it's just like the preferred person. And sometimes that changes. We have stories of there being a preferred wife, and then there's like a usurper that comes in and like steals the king's attention. But a lot of the people who have like many wives, they're alliances. These are strategic political investments. And so what may be seen here is if Abraham's saying, oh, this is my sister, the king wants to bring this rich dude who just comes to town. I mean, remember, we're still working with like the city of people to deal with the sheep and herds and all of that. You want to be on the good side of this. And so one way to do it is, oh, I'll marry your sister. And that's like a bit of good faith. And so you have that kind of political alliances that this king may think he's making to try to get the rich dude on his side. Because the thought is, if I have one of my family members in your house, you're not going to be bad to me, and I'm going to deal fairly with you. I mean, we see that in like medieval Europe as well. So.
Well, the other thing that I noticed that was repetitious, and I don't remember what the other one was, it might have been a lot, but that when somebody has done something that's not so good, they are sent on their way with all sorts of stuff, you know, slaves, food and cattle, and it puzzles me. It's sort of like, you know, I'm going to forgive you. Maybe it's a forgiveness gesture, or if you have stuff, you won't do it again. I don't know, what doesn't make sense. It's puzzling to me. It's a nice gesture, but it's puzzling.
Yeah, it seems weird that it's like, oh, you tricked me, and now I'm going to give you a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
But Mary Ellen, you look like you're going to jump in.
Well, when you were talking about political alliances and other wives, lesser wives being the object of political alliances, Abraham keeps offering his main wife, you know, Sarah. And my understanding with the political wife arrangements, whatever, is they stay. And I don't think Abraham intends for Sarah to stay with King whatever. It's kind of like, well, you can have her for the duration of our visit, but I'm taking her back with me. So I do see a different thing going on. And then in the back of my mind, I'm saying, doesn't Abraham have any lesser wives? You know, is Sarah his only wife? And yeah, it was very common to have lesser, or, you know, wives in spirit only kind of a thing, as well as sexual reasons and so on. But doesn't he have any others?
Well, we see the last time that there was a situation of a potential lesser wife with Hagar, it didn't go well.
It didn't work.
So I know,
sir, not Abraham.
Oh, Abram at the time. So Hagar's still in the mix here. So there's like kind of a secondary person still with questionable status currently. And I know, so this one is a rule that I know comes from Muhammad in the Islamic tradition, which is the only like kind of guideline that I know about, because I'm not an expert at like some of this stuff. I don't actually know the details for it, but what I know, one of the guidelines that came out of that tradition is that you're only allowed as many wives as you can financially support equally. So you have to be able to like keep everyone at the same level of comfort. But you also are supposed to only take on the amount of wives that you can pay attention to. Basically, you're not supposed to emotionally deprive any of your wives. And so I know that's maintained in that tradition. I don't know how historical a practice that is, because there is some thought that some of the guidelines that Muhammad gave to his people that then became the Islamic faith were actually progressive, because he's telling people like, you can't just keep getting wives and then ignoring them. And so there was guidelines for like cultural guidelines of what it meant to have more than one wife. I just don't know what it is at the time. That's just the only reference I do know, that there are boundaries. There is supposed to be boundaries of how you pay attention to having more than one wife at the time. So, but I think you bring up a fair point of, yeah, Abram is using Sarah. It's not like he's giving Hagar to King Abimelech or like a female servant, but at the same time, he doesn't really have another sister to hand off. And at the moment, he doesn't have any daughters. And so there's no one of like equal status that comes from Abram's family himself, because his family at this point is actually kind of narrow, like the blood related family in a way, because he has Lot, but Lot's been in trouble. And then he doesn't really have siblings. He doesn't have kids. So he's kind of in a tough spot if he wants to give King Abimelech someone that's kind of seen as his equal standing. But yeah, theoretically, when Abram decides to head out of town, he would want Sarah to go with him. So like, what's his long-term plan here? Because that seems a little short-sighted. So any other thoughts before we keep moving on in some of the text? So there is one detail that I don't want to miss, if only because it's, this story has a lot of unique details in it, doesn't it? In the middle of verse 7, we see that God says, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet. All of a sudden, Abraham gets the title of prophet, even though we've seen no prophecy come from him yet. This is kind of one of the only times we see Abraham referred to as a prophet, but this is an interesting title to just drop in. What do you all make of this? Is it just one of the many talents he has? Is God making a point? What's with this title here?
Well, it says that God is giving Abraham some status. You know, he's now got a title. So it's a plus for Abraham, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with, they're putting new flooring in the apartment above me. Banging going on. So right now we're at a lull, but I'm going to be muting and unmuting, you know, as they get very well, and when I'm talking, they're going to continue. But lost my train of thought. After this whole sister father thing, in verse 13, and when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kind you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. So there's every intention that this behavior is going to continue. Which I don't like, but that's what he's doing. So now I'm going to put me on mute.
Right. And so we have Abraham's instruction that it's like, Sarah, this is the game plan. We're sticking to it every place we go. This is what you're going to say. Which makes you wonder, were there other times that they also were doing this? Because they've been kind of like meandering a little bit, and it's just like no one took Sarah. And this is like, we have two instances where this is their scheme and she gets taken. But the other detail that we see here is Abram doesn't trust the people he's around. In verse 11, he says, I did this because there's no fear of God. These are like godless people. I am traveling and I don't trust you all to not hurt me. That's God. I'm sorry, if I was King Abimelech, I would be insulted at this point. I don't trust the people I'm traveling around, so I've been passing her off as my sister everywhere I go.
But with Pharaoh, it says the reason Abraham did it is because he thought they would kill him. He did it to preserve himself. Whereas here he's saying, well, the reason I did it is all you people are godless, you know. And so there is a difference, you know, in the purpose of the story. The application seems different. And maybe that's the reason, but why is this story important? It's because of the way Abraham uses it in different contexts.
So I feel like when we talked about chapter 12, we were kind of like, Abraham's being kind of slimy here. was what I remember, because it's like you're trying to save your own. What was that?
I said in our definition.
Right.
Perhaps not so much.
Yes. Liar. Whatever.
But yeah, he's out to save his own skin. He's doing this kind of as like this kind of scheme. What is your perception of him by this character description of the combination of, well, I didn't technically lie, she is my sister, and I'm doing this because you're like the people I'm around are godless. It's not my skin, it's just like you people are bad and I didn't lie.
I kind of wonder why he got picked by God. He seems to, well,
Yeah.
maybe the standard of
Mibalak, whatever, because he did have a relationship with God. So Abraham went into that situation offering Sarah and thinking that he was doing this to the godless. And it turns out that this king had a relation, whether he worshiped the Lord or not, we don't know, but that he had a relationship with the Lord. And so Abraham's running around everywhere he visits, assuming the worst, and got tripped up. And I don't know, I'm kind of losing faith in Abraham's judgment right now. So.
Right. Ironically, this is actually so reading some of the notes and once again the scholarly opinions of this is actually meant to make Abraham look righteous.
And
yeah, because it's one of those that the perception is that he's being pious by his like kind of explanation of like, well, I'm going into lands where there may not be a fear of God, which is kind of like bringing out that religiosity side and like, oh, King Abimelech, you are actually a religious man. How great that I'm in good company and I can trust you. But it's seen as actually kind of trying to rehabilitate him a little bit. And by the fact that he didn't lie this time, we're given the explanation like, well, she's technically my sister. It doesn't make it a straight out lie. Once again, it like toes that line of misleading but true, which makes it's supposed to make it better. It's supposed to make Abraham look righteous.
Backing up a little to King Nibble, whatever, I have to look at it to pronounce it. Why did he send Abraham off with all of these gifts? And, you know, why? I don't know. I don't get it.
So once again, not being an expert on the culture of the time, my guesstimation is it's a no hard feelings present. It's evidently Abraham's a big enough of a deal that it's good to have him on your side. Okay. If God is willing to, what the assumption is that God struck Abimelech with impotence, the context clues of like, I kept you away from her. And at the very end, we see that they were able to conceive children again. That's the resolution after Abraham prays for him, is that they can conceive children. So the like between the lines is God struck him with impotence. And if you have a guy who rolls into town and God is willing to strike you with impotence, you don't want that guy to roll out of town without being on his good side still. So I think it's kind of like here, don't mess with me, please. Kind of no hard feelings. You're fine. I'm not gonna touch your wife. I'm gonna leave you alone. I'm gonna make sure my people leave you alone because I don't want to be struck with impotence again.
But then the Lord blames him and closes the wombs of all the women in his. That's really odd too. It seems over. And the last sentence, for the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
I've been saying that a lot lately. It doesn't make
sense. And you know, at a certain point, it doesn't. these stories are not, I think they are still strange for our modern sensibilities, but like, yeah,
of course.
It almost feels like to me that like, okay, Sarah's in jeopardy. Sarah is part of the covenant at this point, and part of the covenant is bearing children. So as long as she's abducted, no one's gonna have kids. If she cannot have kids by Abraham, no one where she is going to have kids. We're just going to put a halt to everything because the covenant is paused. So everyone's life is paused, and kind of having that ramification of Sarah's barrenness. I mean, at this point, her barrenness by being not able to have relations with her husband, but she's not going to have kids, and therefore no one else is going to.
Okay, but they're already leaving, so it's the very end.
Oh, that was part of the reversal. God's not closing their wombs. They are able to have children because part of what they had, the area had been cursed with, was that that their wombs had been closed.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So that's retroactive, explaining what had gone on.
Oh, I see.
So yeah, no, as they're leaving, they can have kids again.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
it appears from God's standpoint, it wasn't enough just to deal with Abimelech and his relationship with Sarah. He had to deal with all of the people and their relationships to one another. So that was the reason God did the whole thing at the beginning, because he orchestrated the whole thing, including making all the women in the country barren. So he's got to undo all of it at the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So what's our view of God in this story? Because sometimes we see that, like, so in some of the other stories that aren't remember, this is a slightly different tradition than the Yahweh stories. But the Yahweh stories, we have like God walking around as like a dude and two angels. Mm-hmm. We have sometimes where God seems very physical, sometimes where God seems very ethereal, sometimes where it seems like God is kind of like learning on the fly and kind of evolving, making decisions. Other times where God is all-knowing, omnipotent, things are going according to plan. Where does this fall into it? What things are we noticing about how God is working in these stories?
It looks to me like he did the whole thing from beginning to end, and this is they're just telling you about what God did.
Mm-hmm. Why'd he do it? I mean, it doesn't, what's the point? I could.
Well, shows the power of God.
The power of God, okay, because he can. Okay.
This is one of the stories where God seems more powerful, or in more like a like looking down from the clouds, kind of almighty. It kind of has a grandiosity, which is interesting because it's like, this is a more localized story. It's a little bit, it's not like Pharaoh and God is battling Egypt, but it still has this kind of omnipresence where God's not showing up in person. God doesn't have to go look at Sodom and like evaluate what's going on. God goes into the story knowing what's not just what's happening, but what's going to happen. And there's more like an orchestration that we're seeing here. Mm-hmm. Mary Ellen?
Well, it's also that he's a part of the story from the get-go, that he's not just making a proclamation or setting up a situation and then sitting back and watching what happens. He's definitely involved every step of the way, and all the people know it, which, I look at this and I kind of say, okay, what was the point of all of this story and God's manipulations between the men and the women. I mean, it's an interesting story, but what's the point?
So yeah, so let's actually talk about the point. Because we do get a little bit of a snapshot of, I would say, a different side of God's personality. Because I do think, especially in Genesis, God has a personality, and it's not always the one that we're used to, but we get kind of a different view of some of these things. But so what's the point? So my first question is is this story and the Pharaoh story the same story? Are they actually two different versions that have a kernel of truth and have devolved, and they just evolved far enough away from each other that the people compiling Genesis decided that they both were important enough to include? Or are these two events, because it sounds like Abraham has done this more than once, did they both happen and we just have them at different parts in the story because they happened at different times? That's the first question to ask.
I love Larry's reaction.
Okay.
Who can say, you know?
Yeah, but if God is orchestrating it,
Mm-hmm.
Do we know that God is orchestrating it, or do we? Okay.
God's at least meddling in this one. If not orchestrating, God's meddling.
Well, if he's orchestrating it, does Abraham have free will?
That is a question that is discussed. I mean, that's a question throughout the Bible. Yeah. And is actually one of the main points of contention between the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church. And why we actually don't honor each other's ordinations or communions. It all comes down to a debate of, is there actually free will, or is God meddling in everything? And we don't agree, and we never have. So frankly, I can't give you a solid answer because that's still debated.
All right. But if God is punishing you, you got to assume that he's not setting it up and making you bad just so he can beat you up. I mean, it's just it seems like in the Old Testament that the way they explain bad things happening is by pointing to the sin of the people. It's not, we don't really know that the sin of the people causes bad things, but that's the interpretation. That's what God appears to tell the prophets, that you have sinned.
Right. And so this is like a weird thing where they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, saying like, okay, Abimelech, yes, did something he wasn't supposed to, but he was unknowing about it. Yeah. So God does have kind of a punishment, but like also immediately tells him and shows him the remedy that it's not your fault. You are reaping the consequences for this guy's action. You're innocent, but you're feeling the effects. And it's kind of this weird in between where he hasn't sinned. He was innocent. There is still an effect he is feeling. And yet, but God is very open and upfront that I've done this to you. Also, here's a heads up, this is how you need to undo it. This one's really weird in that sin and culpability kind of question too. Abimelech actually didn't do anything wrong.
Okay.
So.
Just got set up.
Mm-hmm. Got set up by Abraham and God.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like God saying, well, to the people who are reading it, well, here's the story. This shows what I can do.
So is it God just flexing his power?
Yeah. Right.
So why I ask the initial question of, are these actually one story that have kind of had the telephone effect where they've been told multiple times to the point where they don't look quite the same, versus two times where it happens? This is one of the times I look at two stories in the Bible saying, there seems to be an actual something that it's based on. Because this story is too weird at a certain point to be based on nothing and be told twice. There's something at the core of this that may be two events and it may be one event that, I mean, you could almost see how one side remembered the name King Abimelech and told like King Abimelech, and then a different group of people, a different family, forgot the name of the king at one point in the story, and so they described it as a really high king of the land that's kind of in the south, and then it just kind of mythologized and grew to the point where, to get the kids' interest when you're story time, you said, oh yeah, it's the pharaoh. And you can know how stories evolve and grow, because that story kind of smooths out the details. It doesn't have some of the nitty gritty. It has the outline of the story though. And so I could see how a story can lose detail, but also become grandiose at the same time, where a different tradition may have been better at preserving details. Details like, oh yeah, Sarah's actually kind of his sister. Also kind of not. I mean, also wife, but also sister, where that detail got dropped in another version of the story. Because notably, the other one's a lot shorter as well. This one takes up a full chapter. The other one didn't.
I'm still bothered about this sister business. Is it true that Abraham and Sarah had the same father but different mothers?
Yeah.
I mean, is that documented?
I mean, all we have is, so there's no record of Abraham outside of the biblical record. We haven't found any archaeological evidence of him or his band of people. We only have stories of the descendants. So for all intents and purposes, it's kind of generally accepted that they were half siblings. That said, it wasn't uncommon, especially for royalty, for that to take place. I mean, there's the classic story of the Spanish crown that was so inbred that they married cousins and siblings, and to the point where they had a malformed jaw that was a recessive gene. And the last heir to that line of the Spanish crown had such a malformed jaw that he had trouble eating, never got married, and just died. If you see portraits of him, it is, I mean, it is large. It basically, the lower jaw just grew until it was such an underbite that his mouth couldn't close. Yeah, a lot of health problems because they were so inbred. And so we do see that it doesn't have as much of an ick factor when you're trying to, it seems like people don't care about marrying siblings when you have a bloodline to preserve. And so anytime bloodlines get put into it, we see people marrying siblings. What I will have to look it up because I actually forget where in Leviticus it is. Leviticus has a long list of people you can and cannot have sex with. And it very much delineates exactly who you can and cannot have, because they're basically like, oh yeah, don't sleep with your neighbor's wife, but like, where are the boundaries of that rule? So they do an attempt at like creating boundaries around it. But I know one of the things that is missing from that list is father-daughter. Father-daughter relationships are okay by biblical standards. Not exactly good, but not outlawed. The one I don't know is if siblings are technically, I know like full siblings are no-nos. I don't know about half siblings, but at the same time, if his father okayed it, women are property. So his father would have had to say yes. But if his father gave his daughter to his son in marriage, then it happens.
Okay.
We're going to see this happen a few times, actually.
Okay, but in the first 20 chapters now, we've read lots of genealogies. Now, did we read a genealogy of Abram, and did we see a genealogy of Sarah that indicated that that was the case?
Women weren't recorded in the genealogies.
Okay.
So the only time we get women in genealogies, I actually think, is the genealogies of Jesus. And there, I think, are 4 women included in the genealogies of Jesus. I believe Sarah's in there.
Okay.
There is Tamar. I think Tamar's in there. There's a prostitute that saves or that escapes from Jericho that's included, and then Ruth from the book of Ruth. And so we have like Ruth, an outsider. We have a prostitute turned heroine. We have, and I think there's 2 matriarchs included, but women, unless they are extraordinary, they're never included in the genealogies.
Okay. But we do have a documentation of who Abram's father was, right? He was mentioned in one of those.
Mm-hmm. That's like right before, if we go back to 12, his father is Terah.
Terah, yeah.
So, but no other record of
say anything about Terah's wife.
Nope. Evidently he had a few though. So, all right, we have a few minutes left. So do we feel like we have at least an understanding of what's going on, even if we don't quite know why this is here?
It seems like a little interruption to the motion towards the goal. You know, the goal to have to produce children and for the nation. And then coming up very soon, there's the testing of Abraham, which was, it's all very confusing, I think. It's, God is weird.
Yeah. Mary Ellen?
I mean, the
lack of understanding of Abraham at this point traveling, that he at one point was no longer a nomad, was settled, had animals, had a community life going, and now we're just seeing him as a roaming man, nomad between different kingdoms.
So
yeah, he keeps moving. I thought he was going to go and settle Canaan.
Abram never settles in the end.
Oh, he doesn't. Okay, that's right.
It's
either does Moses. Okay.
Some of the stories, give the appearance that like he stayed in one place for a little bit. I mean, the land of Canaan is promised to him and his descendants.
Okay.
But what we will see is he never actually fully gives up that nomadic life.
Okay.
We're going to hit a few more episodic stories. But I will say that after we kind of get out of the Abraham narrative, once there is like officially a descendant, the lineage is kind of confirmed to continue. Genesis kind of, like God is involved in the story, but I don't think it has those like Sunday school lessons like we're often accustomed to seeing in biblical stories. Like the narrative of Jesus, it's one of those that like every like paragraph you pause and you draw out the life lesson and you see like the application to your life. We are leaving that territory. We're going to get a few more Abraham stories and we get a little bit more of that, but this story of like Sarah being in danger in some ways is just a story of Abraham's life, and we're going to get a lot of those coming up, and there's not always a life application. I will try my best to draw them out, but trust me, things are about to get weird. Some of the stories coming up are really just like, they always make me think this is too weird to imagine. And it's messy because this is one of the more human parts of the Bible because it's family drama. There's family drama for ages. And you're just looking at this and going, why? Why did you want to preserve some of this messy, ugly family drama? But they do. And I think that is actually, that as like a big concept actually says something about our faith and about our tradition of maintaining stories of messy people with complicated lives that are like, even Abraham, God's chosen, is anything but perfect. He is far and away from anything considered perfect. And yet, this is like God's dude. So that's what's up ahead. But yeah, first we're about to get an official descendant, and then we're immediately going to put him in danger as well.
Okay.
So let's see, for next week, we have read all of 21. There's basically 21. There's at least 2 stories included in it. There may be a few like minor episodes in it, but King Abimelech is going to come up again. So
okay, I'll be absent next time.
That's all right.
I always ahead. I want to find out what's going to happen.
Oh, all right. Well, shall I pray us out for today?
Yes.
All right, let's go to God. God, you know, sometimes it's what we read is really confusing. And the stories we read about how you have interacted in the world doesn't exactly line up with our experience of how we have experienced you interact with our own lives. I know sometimes we wish that you would pull the strings just a little bit more, and other times we wonder about how much you're active outside of our lives and in the lives of others in ways that we can't see. So as we go out today, I ask you to be present in our thoughts, in our dreams, in our ponderings. Be there to help guide us and help us recognize that we are not in a land of godless people, but truly there are people like King Abimelech that are more faithful than we realize, that have relationships with you that we may not expect, and trust that, yes, you are at work all over the world, and not just a distant God, but a God who is in relationship and is very close at hand. So guide us through the rest of the week until we gather again. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
See you next week.